All right, folks. Welcome to this week's edition of Satterwhite Live. We're going to talk about something that most people who dream of a log home might be the last thing they consider, but it's important, and it should be something that you're thinking about up front before you get that home. And that is, even though we all dream of that log home to get away from the rat race and out of the busy city and all that, once we get out in the woods, it's not really like that meme that says, could you live in this home for 5 years without the internet? Well, it's just not the world we live in. And so most of us want to have access to Netflix. We want to keep in touch with our friends and family on Facebook. If you're like me, more and more, YouTube's more important to me than cable TV or all that kind of thing. My wife likes to watch movies, but I'm over there watching Netflix or YouTube on an iPad. So it's important to consider. That's one of those things. This really grew out of the topic that we were discussing recently about how to pick land for a log home. And the thing about internet connectivity is in rural areas is that it can be anywhere on the board, what the availability may be. So we're going to talk about a couple of things right quick, and just the real meat of this is how to calculate how much bandwidth that you need. And I know that I support a lot of computer users here at Satterwhite Log Homes, and maybe they're not really maybe conversant about bandwidth or appreciate how much. Think of bandwidth like water pipes, and how big of plumbing do you need to have at your location? Unfortunately, when it comes to internet, until recently, we're going to at the end of this episode of Satterwhite Live, we are going to talk about some emerging opportunities. Now, I'm not going to get extremely technical in all this because it's real easy. These things are real easy to research on the internet yourself. But you should appreciate the differences in services that are out there. So you can go from just a trickle, a little water pipe that wouldn't feed an ice maker in your refrigerator, up to a water main or a viaduct that would supply the city of Los Angeles. That's pretty much an exaggeration, but when it comes into rural, the location of your home and the place that you're thinking about building, those options are very specific to your location. So, the one thing that's important, and I'll say this about the way internet services are sold, about bandwidth. It used to be that it was sold, you're going to have to learn a little bit of vocabulary. It's just like money. All of us have an idea if we're talking in the hundreds of dollars, in the thousands of dollars, in the 10,000s of dollars, or hundreds of thousands we get in these graduated areas. When you start talking about the internet as far as doing simple things like email and just the basic task, your online banking, even simple things like shopping, Amazon, whatever the things you do, those are not real strenuous. Those don't require enormous amounts of bandwidth. But when you really start getting into the modern world and living in the modern life, where simply put, the threshold gets to be when you start wanting to do things with video, as we are here. And I expect video is important to everybody who would be watching Satterwhite Live, because you're consuming your bandwidth consumption. When you start it takes enormous amounts of data to watch video without buffering. And buffering is simply when your pipes aren't big enough for the data stream that you're getting. And there's all kinds of tricks that they do to like your video, if you have a poor internet connection, you can still do things like watch YouTube and Netflix, but you don't see it at great quality because it downscales to slower and slower rates at lesser and lesser picture quality. But all of us pretty much these days have big screen televisions, and if we want, bandwidth is increasingly important. Now, traditionally, when you shop for bandwidth, and we're going to go into talking about the kinds of people who sell bandwidth in rural areas in the second half of this presentation today. But typically, you know, from the beginning of time, end users at their homes are regarded by the people who sell bandwidth as consumers of data. In other words, you consume Netflix, the downstream. So they quote a speed, but I'm gonna throw something into this because it's important. The downstream speed, when you calculate what your requirements are for your home and how much bandwidth you need to buy, that downstream is significant, and it allows you to do things like watch Netflix or Amazon Prime or any of the various online on-demand video services without buffering, and have a great experience doing that, or watch YouTube or Facebook video as we're doing here today. But when you move to that log home, or you move out into the country, or whatever your journey takes you to, and you need to work, and so all of a sudden conducting Zoom conferences, all these things, these new technologies that we've been had to become familiar with this year during the pandemic. So if you're a school teacher, for instance, and you're going to do remote teaching from home, then it's not the downstream that is the limiting factor. You need to also be looking, when you shop for your options for bandwidth, you need to be talking about the upstream, because at that point it's not about you consuming data, it's about you pushing data out to the internet. And I'll guarantee you, the little studio we've built here for Satterwhite Live, we've considered all those types of aspects. And, you know, following this, any of you who get into, you know, if you're dealing with Satterwhite and you're working, I'd be glad to talk to any of you individually as you consider these things. Any of your salesmen, all the salespeople at Satterwhite, doesn't matter where in the country, who you may be dealing with in any of our offices across the country, they all know me, and so they don't mind calling me at all or putting me in touch. So I'm just throwing that out there as the consumer level, past that consumer level of data consumption, to start looking at the upstream capabilities so that you'll be able to interact with Zoom and those kind of things. Okay, I'm going to just run through the. We're not in the normal studio today. What did I do? Because I'm the only one in the office building today. So I'm sitting back here in basically the control studio of Satterwhite Live so that we could do something today and see you guys. Okay, let's talk about the issues of internet in rural areas. And this, I mean, some of you already live out in the country or outside the city limits, and you may be aware of this. And we've all probably are old enough to recall, well, America Online and starting on those slow modems that sounded like a fax machine, and just, I mean, the progress, but how soon we become comfortable with new things. So pretty much all of us have broadband. There was a time when the telephone companies were the early providers of bandwidth. And they're still a cornerstone, one of your main options as you look at your log home, where you might want to build a property, where you're going to locate the house on your existing property, all the issues. There's going to come in, the telephone companies will still be one of your primary things that you'll need to look at for your log home as a potential source of internet connectivity at your home. So this all comes down to an issue that's a 100-year-old issue. There's nothing new under the sun, and the issue that's faced in bandwidth delivery to that rural home is this. It's called the last mile. So there's tons of bandwidth out there in the world. If you live in the city currently, I mean, my brother's place in Plano, Texas, he had access to fiber optic service almost 10 years ago. And I would go to his house and just be blown away at what could be done. Even as recently as 2 years ago, here in Longview, Texas, I kept an office downtown where a lot of the Satterwhite technology was, because the last mile didn't extend to our offices at Satterwhite. Now, Satterwhite, like most of you, are as a company, that internet, it was not even a factor when we considered, oh, let's build an office in Gunnison, Utah. When that property, the real estate deals were done, it's on the edge of town, there's other things around, but we didn't have great connectivity there in the beginning. Our office in North Georgia, in Ellijay, that was certainly not there. I'll tell my war stories later, because not that they will, I think my experience will help each of you as you approach sorting out what your options are at your home and what you can do. But that last mile, when I say nothing new under the sun, that last mile thing was the driving force 100 years ago when electricity was a new thing in the world. And the cities became, you know, this was Thomas Edison, those guys were, Nikola Tesla were still, you know, these guys were designing the electrical grid as we know it today, and there were some false starts. It's pretty comical. I've actually got friends, not that I know personally, but people in England, and England still has existing a multitude of electrical standards, and you'll have homes. The electricians who work in England have to be pretty conversant when they encounter different electrical systems that are now antiquated. So the United States has been pretty fortunate, and about 100 years ago, the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, it's not been quite 100 years ago, but it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt in that administration. Can you believe, as recent as World War II, there's still people living today who were born before there was, well, there's a lot of people living today who were born before all this, before indoor plumbing was prevalent at a lot of rural locations. So the same problems were faced then. The electrical power came fast to the cities because of population density, because the cost of doing that was low. When you get out in the rural areas, it's the same as now. We all need to have these things at a price we can afford. But at the same time, when I'm in our Utah office, there's been a time or two where I'll be up in the mountains. I mean, the scenery out there is phenomenal. And I'll see a UPS truck, and they've been driving maybe 200 miles to deliver a single package that somebody paid $7 for. And so that driver's going to spend 4 hours of his day and hundreds of miles on that vehicle. The return's just not there. Now, it's interesting how these things evolve, and how sometimes the government got involved to help pay for the build out of the electrical grid 100 years ago, so that every farmhouse in America has electricity today. So how's that going to happen in rural internet? Anyway, it's not quite that bad. I mean, we do have electricity out, and so your options are much improved and getting better at a huge rate of speed. So rather than me telling all my stories, I'm just going to go through some of the options that you would have, and you will have to explore these things individually at your location where you're going to live. And then I'll tell my war stories about us here at Satterwhite and how I've dealt with multiple small little telcos, cable companies. I've had I've explored everything. So, and there'll be some things in there that will probably be beneficial for you for those of you who stick around. I mean, your first place to call when you know the exact location that you're going to build your log home is the local telephone company. And so that can be, and they can be anywhere across the board about what their capabilities are. We'll discuss three separate small little telcos here in just a minute. I hope I've got audio. Just occurred to me I should check my audio levels this far into this thing to see if you guys even could hear anything. I don't have anybody here to help me monitor this, and I would love to be watching the chat room. Tim Woods, Sam Hughes. I see some people in here. I'm looking over my shoulder. You know something? There's probably some great comments in chat too. But your local telco company is the first place to look. This would be a more rare availability issue because generally cable television companies are built out inside cities, and they built out their infrastructure, and all the cost is in that last mile, just like UPS. All the cost, their distribution network's completely efficient until that driver has a delivery 200 miles down a road in southern Utah where there's just nobody there. The last mile is where all the expense is, and so that's the reason that you have to look carefully at who the players are. But there are situations such as our main office here at Satterwhite Log Homes. We're not inside the city limits of Longview, Texas, but we're just about a mile down the road, and so the cable company, Longview Cable, which has a contract with the city of Longview, and they're obligated to provide every cable service to everyone in the city. Their contract with the city back in the day required that of them. I know the exact to the foot down the highway here where their service ends, and that never worked out for me. I finally, because I was seeking bandwidth at the Satterwhite headquarters for 15 years, almost 20 years before we got serious bandwidth out here, and we were just, it was a battle. But the cable television, eventually I got a letter from the chief engineer of their home office that said, Mr. Grizzle, we do not now, nor will we ever, offer internet connectivity to Satterwhite Log Homes. Please don't call us again. You know, it's just, I got a letter like that. But if you're on, your results may vary. If you're building right on the edge of town or some kind of thing like that, you never can tell. That's one of the places to look. Another thing that we've had an option here, in one of the first ways that we got into bandwidth here at the Satterwhite office was through a microwave link. And this is just our good fortune, but there are people who do microwave links that can throw bandwidth in a line of sight. So they're going to have a tower, and you might know these guys. I don't know how to find these guys. I found a guy here, a provider named VioLink here in the north of Longview. And the guy is very interesting. His primary business, I believe, is he does microwave links to put bandwidth on offshore oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. But his family has land north of, you know, it's just but he has microwave towers. But there are, in the area of northeast Texas, which is a very rural area north of Longview, some of the people who have helped me are involved in school districts. And so those microwave links can be incredibly reliable and get you big bandwidth. However, you may have to have an unsightly tower. You'll have to be literally in line of sight of their transmitter, even though you might not be able to see it to the visible eye. But if you look at inside the city limits, any place there's a tower, for instance, the water tower, Longview, the city of Longview, Texas is named because of a high promontory, and on top of that promontory there used to be 3 water towers, but there's still a gigantic water tower. And those of us who live here and know what we're looking at, if you look at that water tower, you will see all kinds of radio equipment affixed to that tower now. So even though I can't walk outside here and see that tower, it's out there. And if I were to build a tower here or whatever gets me in visible sight, I could have a microwave link there to grab bandwidth. These are all, whenever you start talking about tower construction and everything, this is not something that most homeowners want to do. Now, most homeowners are they're going to think things like, well, DirecTV sells internet connectivity. Frankly, I think that offering is probably not very viable going forward. The way you have to understand how this works, DirecTV does have a downlink from their satellite, so the downstream is there. It's not super bandwidth, so it's not slow and it's not going to pick up speed. Their system just doesn't have that much capacity. But when you click a link in a web browser or your upstream side, your upstream request for a page actually goes out over the telephone system, through an old-fashioned modem, because they don't have an upstream capability of the satellite, they just have a downstream. So you would never be able to do things like Zoom or any of those kind of where you have to have some upstream bandwidth to go to. So I would kind of rule out DirecTV at this point. Once upon a time, when I was desperate to find bandwidth here, I called Hughes. And I thought they were the most honest company ever. Before the lady who answered the phone, their operators at that time were trained to do this. The very first thing out of in the conversation was, do you have any possible option for internet bandwidth besides Hughes? And you had to say no to that before they would even want to talk to you, which just that's a little informative about these matters. Okay, I'm going to mention one more avenue that people get into approach, and I've had friends who do this by doing cell data modems, and that's entirely dependent on the location of your house, how good the cell towers are, the cell data service. You're going to be on a shared pool and in rural areas. It works for some people. I had a friend who lived out halfway between here and New Diana. He's passed away now, but that's how he got his internet service, was on a cell data. It's usually an expensive option, and it's usually metered. A lot of us want to have unlimited data so that we don't have to worry if we've watched a couple of movies on Netflix that we need to throttle our service or quit using the internet, or we're going to get like cell phone bills that are going to ramp up. It's just when you get into the cell data area, there's just so much to keep track of, money-wise and technology-wise, to understand your usage. So you have to be careful with that cell data. But it works for some people. I've had an experience with a cell data myself over the past week, and you can even get into, when you have to have upstream with cell data, you have to get into what's called bonded cell data modems, where you actually have to buy a device that has multiple SIM cards and you're putting a multiplier on your cell data cost, because you're aggregating multiple cell phones so that you get enough data on that stream. So that's not great. Okay, so I'm going to give you, let me check my deal. Wow, I go too long with these things. I'm sorry. But it's a holiday as we do this, so maybe some of you will want to stick around for our war stories. The most exciting thing that's happening right now, and it's building out, it's in beta, but I think, how can we not live in this year and not be aware of Elon Musk and Tesla and electric cars and everything that's going on? And that guy who made his money with an internet, on the internet early on, and then he just rolled the dice. He says, this is the way I think what the world needs, and he's tried a bunch of things. Now I have a grandson who's 10 years old now, Gabriel, and Gabriel got fascinated with Tesla cars, and I couldn't give two hoots. I like to drive cross country, But because my grandson was, I mean, he's obsessive about, he wants to talk on every time I get with him, he wants to talk about, Papa, would you like the, you know, he wants to not just talk about Tesla cars, he wants to talk about the pros and cons of various models and which one I'd prefer. And he can have the conversation and come back to it 2 hours, and he can talk longer about Tesla than I can about bandwidth. So because of Gabriel's interest, I started reading up on Elon Musk, and I watched a bunch of YouTube just so that I'd know something about it. And it's a lot more fascinating than maybe I initially gave it credit for. But anyway, one of the other ventures, which is kind of off my radar because I'm that age and living my life, and I haven't been, but I grew up. I grew up in the 60s in the space age, and boy, that's some of my first memories is drawing rockets and in Gemini space capsules and watching. That was what I was doodling in my elementary classrooms. And so if you're like me and grew up in that era, when I've said that Hughes Satellite and DirecTV and all these guys, well, the internet happened sort of after they came along. It was, so they've kind of lashed on the internet delivery systems. But Elon Musk and SpaceX, who is now currently launching, has an incredible launch schedule going on, is building out a satellite that's purpose-built for internet delivery to rural areas, not for metropolitan areas, not appropriate for that, but for rural areas. And that's really the most exciting thing happening in, as this system, if it proves out, and the beta tests and the things that I'm reading, I can't give any definitive on it, but it's very exciting. It means that you could basically build anywhere. It's a constellation. It will ultimately be, I understand, about 8,000 low orbit satellites. I've been told that each one's the size of a school bus. They must not weigh like a school bus, because I read, preparing for today, I read let me show you this, if I can find it here. That's not it. I did go on. No, so SpaceX is the rocket system that Elon Musk is doing, and they are doing contract launches from Cape Canaveral, you know, as a contractor to NASA or the Department of Defense. They're doing launches regularly, but as part of their other business model, they have developed a company called Starlink. And this will be old news to a lot of you, and this will be dated even as I talk here. And they're just doing some incredibly innovative things, like reusing launch vehicles 7 times. This is the one that launched 2 days ago. And if I read this right, they were going to do 2 launches in a weekend. I mean, they are really lifting some satellites up there. And they are putting these things in this low orbit, thousands of them, so that you can have terrific internet at your rural home, which is great. We'd all love to have fiber optics, and if this thing wasn't going so long, I don't know, this is the SpaceX launch just a couple of days ago that I've got on the screen here, if I'm showing what I intend to. So this is a website called space.com that I was reading overnight, and they were just showing some of the cool stuff. And I think that they didn't, they scrubbed a mission that had 80 of the Starlink satellites that they're marching towards that 8,000 satellites in orbit goal. Now you can look at the Starlink itself, the way they are building that network. It's currently in beta test, and you can get this service today, but only they're building it out so that it is in the availability in North America right now is in the southern latitudes of Canada and the northern latitudes of the United States, and you have to apply as a beta tester. So if you're living across the South and like where I'm at, this is not an option, but it's coming. It's coming soon. It's going to be worldwide. I mean, everybody out there who's following this, can you imagine people who own recreational vehicles and things? There's a lot of excitement about this product. I guess that's one of their satellites. Less mass, more compact. Wow. So I haven't really gone through and read all about their system, but this is probably the most exciting thing, even though for many of us it's not available today. But hey, if you started building your log home right now, you know, next year, it's not going to be long. It's not going to be long. And in the reports that I'm reading, the beta testers across the northern part of the United States are just thrilled to have this. So, hey, that's good. Guys, y'all can drop out. I don't want to make this show too long, and I've already talked too long. Let me see if I can just do something real quick about telling you a couple of gotchas, maybe, with getting internet service to your log home or you're in rural parts of the United States. Because I was talking to a friend of mine named Larry Bennett and his son and daughter-in-law, his daughter-in-law is a school teacher. Well, he's retired military, and they just bought a home, and they knew that bandwidth was very important to their house, and they had done all these research steps that we've been talking about and exploring the potential vendors. And so the people that owned the house, they bought an existing house, Larry was telling me, and they made sure that it had great internet because she was going to need to teach school from home. And so fine, they bought that house. And when they went out, they called up. They already knew that the internet was available in the area, and they called. And lo and behold, they said, we can't get you connected. And there was it was like a stunning problem for them. And Larry said the problem is that when you get the physical build out of a network, that whoever the vendor was, whether there's a telco or whoever it was, did not have enough capacity in the area to meet demand. And so when the previous owner of the home sold the house, turned off their service, the new owners come in thinking that they could just turn the service on, and only to discover that they were on a waiting list. And the waiting list could be, I mean, what are you doing? Waiting on how many people are ahead of you on that waiting list? And how many people have to sell their homes before you're going to get a shot at getting connected? So, bandwidth, it's like that. Even the Starlink thing, there's some considerations, some gotchas in that. For one thing, if you're going to build that house up in the trees, that's going to be the type. It's got a special kind of a little satellite dish. I've not seen one. I don't know how. I've seen pictures of them. You can go on their website or YouTube and see these things, but it's got to have an unobstructed view of the entire sky. So that antenna is going to have to be located way away from trees and anything that could block it. And the other, I'll mention another gotcha. I didn't go into this technology earlier, but there's a lot of buzz, and we're all hearing about 5G, cell data networks. And I think that I wouldn't bank on 5G or hold out any great hopes about 5G for a residential internet service. And I'll tell you why. Because that's such a short wavelength that it's capable of incredible density and data capacity, but it's very fragile. And so that those 5G cell towers, it can't be built on a big cell tower that is 2 miles off. They have to put them on every light pole or something going down the highway. And any obstruction whatsoever, even the fluttering leaves of a tree can block that, or rain, all those kind of things. So the motivation on 5G, it's going to be terrific for people when the 5G networks get fully built out. It's going to be terrific for people traveling the highways and your cell phone is in just line of sight to a 5G tower right close to you. You're going to have terrific connectivity. But as far as a log home out in the woods, off the highway, I'm a little more a little more concerned on that. And I'd say at this point, the Starlink option presents more promise to log homeowners. Okay. Goodness, I didn't plan to talk forever, guys. I'm going to go. Any of you who are still with me, I think a lot of us, it being a holiday, might have a little leisure time, those of us who are not cooking and hosting. So I'll just go through a quick bit of the Satterwhite story if I can. So we've dealt with a number of little telcos, and even when you deal with a telephone company, the range of technology that telephone companies have been able to offer over paired copper wires has changed significantly over the years. And some telcos at certain locations, depending on the distance from their central office, the cable length of these things, whether they work or don't work, and it varies not with the company, but also with the location of your house. So it's just one of those things that you have to figure out on a case-by-case basis. So there were services. The earliest broadband service that I personally had experience with was called ISDN, Integrated Services Digital Network, and that was 128 kilobit, and that would be pitiful by today's standards, to tell you the truth. Just pitiful bandwidth. You couldn't watch Netflix or anything on ISDN at all. And then over copper wires, the telco had developed another service called ADSL. DSL, Digital Subscriber Line, and you're getting into, I'm not sure, DSL is probably what we've got at our home, so depending on, again, it's distance sensitive, how long the wires are between you and the central office or whatever equipment. DSL does get up to the range that you can enjoy Netflix and things. So, and then you get up that some of the telcos offer fiber optics. So we have one of our, I'm just going to give you a little view. I was hoping to see, let me switch this on. I'm going to get, this is miserable, but you can look over my shoulder if you'd like while I browse the internet here. I don't know what I'm showing. I don't know, maybe I had this up before. I'm losing track of what I'm doing. That's when you're talking and running the technology at the same time. ETC is Ella J Telephone Company out of Ella J, Georgia, and they've been a great vendor to us. The nice thing about dealing with, and this is in the telephone industry, you'll hear me use the word telco. The telephone industry is so full of acronyms and everything. ETC is Ella J Telephone Company, and they've built a special website just for their internet services, because more and more the IP services data is becoming more important than traditional POTS. That's another acronym, plain old telephone service, because a lot of us are using voice over IP technology. A lot of us are disconnecting those landlines. So all these little telephone companies, data services are becoming more important to their business than their traditional telephone business. So we've got a long history with LJ Telephone service, and the great thing within the telephone industry, now all of us have heard of people like AT&T and Verizon and all the big carriers, but when you get out in that rural area, you know, it's a coin toss, and more likely, in my experience, more likely than not, you're going to be dealing with the small end of the telephone company, and it's like 100 years ago again now, what's called a mom and pop telco. And literally this LJ Telephone Company is owned by people who live in LJ. All the engineers live in LJ, Georgia. You can call people, and so it's great because you can call somebody on the phone, where here, if I call AT&T tech support, I'm going to be talking to somebody in India, and they're going to be working off of a script, and you know, it can be that level of tech support is great. So a lot of times working with mom and pop telcos in rural areas is a wonderful, wonderful experience. And I've had some wonderful experience with mom and pop telcos recently. I won't go into, you know, there's some downsides too, I'll tell you. I mean, not to air anybody's dirty laundry here, but I mean, This is, I just switched web browsers, and now this one is a company called G-Telco. This is Gunnison Telephone Company in Gunnison, Utah, where Satterwhite's principal sawmill facilities are located in Gunnison. And G-Telco has been wonderful. I recognize these people when I call them, and when we converse, I mean, I recognize people's voices. It's that great. They recognize my voice when I call them. So it's all those great things. But at the same time, they're a little bitty mom and pop telco. And literally, G-Telco, again, the owner lives in town. The people at our sawmill know him socially because Gunnison is such a small little place. I mean, they grew up there. They've known him they've known the family since they were kids. G-Telco's been around for 100 years. So that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. At the same time, as a telephone provider, they're a small little mom and pop telco, literally. So I think that this has been resolved. So, you know, a little family business doesn't go out and buy state-of-the-art equipment. So when Satterwhite opened our sawmill in Gunnison 20 years ago, maybe a little better than 20 years ago now, it was curious because at that time, it was about the time we had, but due to pagers and cell phones, we had a proliferation of area code numbers. And the switching equipment that Gunnison Telco owned, G-Telco owned at that time, didn't have the capacity. They had hit their capacity. Nobody ever thought we'd have, you know, thousands of area code prefixes until everybody started carrying pagers at the time and cell phones since. And so they hit the capacity and they could not enter all the area codes into their switch. So if you're somebody like Satterwhite, I mean, for most of their customers never even knew there was a problem because you're just calling your family here in, you know, up in Salt Lake Valley or whatever, and around the region. But for a company like Satterwhite, the national company, and our sales guys or whoever, and me, when I'm doing tech work in that office and I have to call a vendor, I type in a certain area code and it wouldn't route, and it has to revert. At that point, dealing with G-Telco at the time reverted back to like the old-fashioned day where you would call up Lily Tomlin's, or whatever her name is, you know, at the operator I had to call the telephone company and say, okay, I need to call area code, you know, 701. And they would have to look at their switch and see an area code that hadn't been used in a long time or seldom used, take that out and program the area code I wanted to call into their switch, and then they would call me back and say, you can place your call now. So, I mean, that's, I know they've upgraded their switches since then, but you run into those kind of little interesting things. Now, I know G-Telco, again, these people have been so phenomenal to work with. And you just, you know, you build relationship with vendors so that we're extremely loyal to them, even though we're not even literally telephone customers anymore, because all of our equipment relies on IP data services provided by this little mom and pop telco, and they've done a great job. But you may have to work on your log home, wherever you build out in the country, you may have to work through issues like that. Then I've jumped to another telephone company. This one is ETEX. And again, this is another small telco. I wouldn't exactly call them a mom and pop because they are a telephone cooperative. And so I don't know too much about their history or their organizations, but they are a bigger company than either L&J Telephone Company or Gunnison Telephone Company. Our vendors in North Georgia and in Utah. So ETEX is a co-op, and I think of them more like dealing with an REA, Upshur County Rural Electric Co-op. You would deal with for this is the city, the county seat out north of where we at Satterwhite are. And so ETEX is the vendor for data services at the Satterwhite farm. And so I take care of, you know, technology at the Satterwhite's residents out there too, so I'm familiar with their, you know, their speeds and you know ETEX has done a phenomenal job of building out a fiber optic network. And so you may get lucky with your local telephone co-op, or even a mom and pop, possibly, that wherever you build your log home, you may be able to get fiber optic bandwidth. That would be phenomenal. But unfortunately, ETEX does not have fiber optic to the Satterwhite farm. So we're on a DSL line out there, and it's just, you know, it's not going to be the experience that you would love, particularly on the upstream. If you're having to do, if you've got kids and they're attending school remote and needing to do Zoom and that kind of thing, it's not the best. But a lot of people, ETEX has fiber optic out there. Now, ETEX is in the county north of where we are here at the Satterwhite office. And one of my war stories, and again, this isn't going to impact you. I think that the Starlink service, it holds promise to be a definitive solution for log home owners wherever you build in any rural location in the United States, so long as you can get a clear view of the skies, unobstructed view of the skies from your location. But like I said, for 20 years, I was desperate to find bandwidth here at the Satterwhite office, and I on 2-year intervals, I had a long list that I would just go knocking on doors, and wore out my welcome at the Longview Cable TV and their parent company, as I told earlier. So at some point, ETEX came to they were able to provide big bandwidth, and at a price that, you know, it made sense for Satterwhite. And so everything was good until the last sentence of the conversation. And that is because their infrastructure comes down Highway 259 here in front of the Satterwhite office. It only comes to the county line north of us here. And they said, well, we'll sell you this much bandwidth. And I'm going, yeah, that's what I want. That's what we want, that amount of bandwidth. And we'll sell it for this price. And I'm getting all excited. And yeah, that's what we need. That's what we need. And then they would say, but we're going to have to charge you for 2 miles of construction costs down the highway right away at $500,000. So that directly gets into the same conversation that we've had in episodes of Satterwhite Live about choosing land and being careful about developed land versus undeveloped land, and knowing your construction cost. And because, you know, if you're going to bring in, you know, well water and septic systems, that's usually not a problem. But you have to look at all those things that if you've always lived in the city, you need to look at all those details. I mean, Satterwhite, we've been around forever, and I've heard war stories around here. I mean, occasionally, a lot of people dream of building out in New Mexico or Colorado or someplace, and you'll hear some story of a development of land in Colorado, and it's just those things that are too good to be true. Too good to be true. And land, I can't believe you can buy land for that anywhere on earth, and that beautiful scenic, and it's gorgeous. Everything about it's gorgeous. And you buy it, and then you find out it's going to cost $1 million to bring in electrical power to that location. Well, you know, maybe that works in you know, we have a lot of people who want to build off the grid, but you'd definitely be looking at a creative solution. If you can build a log home anywhere, just consider all these little things that go with it. Goodness, folks, I have talked too long. Let me see if I've got, that's my conversation about Tesla and SpaceX and Starlink. They're all related. But I do think, and the Starlink thing is actively launching this constellation of satellites right now. I think this is something where you want to pretty much maybe start your research, unless your mom and pop telco or local provider, if you get lucky at your location, I think it would still be better if you've got fiber optic. That would be better. But I think my priorities would be fiber optic if you can get it, Starlink number 2, and then from there your DSL maybe from a local telco, and beyond DSL you get into cell data and all these other things that we've discussed today, and you're kind of in a world of hurt. But luckily I think that the Starlink will have coverage almost anywhere you might be thinking of building your log home, being out there. I talk too much. All right, guys. Thanks for being with us today, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday weekend and a wonderful holiday season. Thanks for being with us. I got to think of the buttons to push.